call came through on a Tuesday morning in March 2024. Detective Maria Santos picked up on the second ring, her coffee halfway to her lips, when she heard the words from the state forensics lab. 28 years. 28 years of waiting, of wondering, of that case file sitting in the cold case drawer with Jennifer Hartwell's school photo paper clipped to the front. And now, suddenly, impossibly, they had him. The DNA match was conclusive. The man who had murdered 15-year-old Jennifer Hartwell on a February afternoon in 1996 was Robert Mitchell, 59 years old, retired high school guidance counselor, volunteer at the local food bank, grandfather of 4. He'd been living in Dearborn Heights, just 11 miles from where Jennifer's body had been found, in that abandoned warehouse on Detroit's east side, for the past 14 years. Santos set down her coffee without drinking it, and reached for her phone to call the family. Her hand was shaking. She'd been a detective for 8 years, had made difficult calls before, but this one felt different. This was the call that Patricia Hartwell had been waiting for since 1996. The call that would finally give a name to the nightmare that had consumed her family for nearly 3 decades. Santos took a deep breath, steadied herself, and dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, and then Patricia Hartwell's voice came through, cautious and weary, a voice that had answered too many calls over too many years, a voice that had learned not to hope too hard. Santos identified herself and asked if Patricia could come to the station. There'd been a development, a significant development. She didn't say more than that. Didn't want to deliver this news over the phone. Didn't want Patricia to be alone when she heard it. Within 20 minutes, Patricia would be sitting across from Santos in an interview room, learning that her daughter's killer finally had a name. Jennifer Marie Hartwell was born on August 12, 1980, at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. She came into the world at 6 pounds, 9 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and her father's blue eyes. She was the youngest of 3 children, with 2 older brothers who doted on her despite the typical sibling rivalry that erupted over bathroom time and whose turn it was to control the TV remote. Her mother, Patricia Hartwell, worked as a nurse at the same hospital where Jennifer had been born, often pulling double shifts to help make ends meet. Her father, Thomas, was a machinist at a Chrysler plant, one of thousands of men who kept Detroit's automotive industry running, who came home with grease under their fingernails and pride in their work. They lived in a modest brick house on Fairmont Street in Detroit's East English Village neighborhood, a working-class area where people knew their neighbors and watched out for each other's kids, where block parties still happened in the summer, and where kids still played street hockey until the streetlights came on. It was the kind of neighborhood that felt safe, the kind of place where parents didn't worry about letting their children walk to school or ride their bikes to the corner store. It was the kind of place where what happened to Jennifer Hartwell wasn't supposed to be possible. Jennifer was a sophomore at Southeastern High School, a large urban school with nearly 2,000 students, where she was neither popular nor invisible, just comfortably in the middle. She played clarinet in the school band, not particularly well, but with an enthusiasm that made up for technical deficiency. Her band director, Mr. Henderson, would later tell investigators that Jennifer always showed up for practice, always tried her best, always had a smile on her face, even when she was struggling with a difficult passage. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She'd wanted this for as long as anyone could remember, ever since she was 7 years old and the family cat, Whiskers, had gotten sick, and the vet had saved him. From that day forward, Jennifer had been fascinated by animals, by the idea of helping them, healing them. She volunteered at a local animal shelter on Saturday mornings, cleaning cages and socializing the cats and dogs, learning everything she could. The shelter director, Carol Martinez, would remember Jennifer as one of the most dedicated volunteers they'd ever had, someone who showed up even when the work was dirty and difficult, someone who genuinely cared about every single animal that came through their doors. She had a collection of stuffed animals that she'd officially outgrown, but couldn't bring herself to pack away, arranged with care on her bedroom shelves. Her favorite was a worn elephant named Peanut that she'd had since she was 3, its fur matted from years of being carried everywhere. One eye slightly loose, a patch on its belly where the seam had split, and Patricia had carefully sewn it back together. Jennifer still slept with Peanut every night, though she would have been mortified if her friends had known. She was in love, or what passes for love at 15, with a boy named Marcus Washington, who sat behind her in algebra and sometimes passed her notes, folded into elaborate origami shapes, cranes and flowers and stars. Jennifer had saved every single one in a shoebox under her bed, had pressed them flat and arranged them chronologically, had sometimes taken them out to reread them when she was alone in her room. Marcus had kissed her once, behind the gym after a basketball game in January, and Jennifer had written about it in her diary in purple ink, had drawn hearts around his name, had replayed that moment over and over in her mind. She'd been planning to talk to him on Valentine's Day, maybe give him the card she'd bought at the drugstore, maybe see if he wanted to go to a movie that weekend. She never got the chance. February 14th, 1996 was a Wednesday. Valentine's Day. Jennifer woke up at 6:15, earlier than usual, because she wanted extra time to get ready. She'd set her alarm, had laid out her clothes the night before, jeans and an oversized burgundy sweater that her mother had bought her for Christmas. A sweater that was soft and warm and made her feel confident. She'd borrowed her mother's curling iron without asking, had planned to return it before Patricia noticed it missing, had carefully curled the ends of her long brown hair the way she'd seen in a magazine. She wore white keds that she'd drawn small hearts on in red marker the night before, sitting at her desk with her tongue stuck out in concentration, trying to make each heart perfect. She ate breakfast at the kitchen table with her father, who was working the early shift at the plant and had to leave by 7. Cheerios with sliced banana, her usual breakfast, eaten while Thomas read the sports section of the Detroit Free Press and drank his coffee black. Thomas Hartwell would remember this breakfast for the rest of his life, would remember every single detail with painful clarity. He would remember that she'd seemed happy, that she'd hummed while she ate, something soft and melodic that he couldn't quite identify. He would remember that she'd been wearing strawberry lip gloss, that she'd had the Valentine's card for Marcus tucked into her backpack. He would remember that she'd kissed him on the cheek before heading out the door, had said, "Happy Valentine's Day, Dad," and he'd called after her, "Have a good day, sweetheart," and he'd watched her walk down the driveway toward the bus stop at the corner. That was the last time he saw his daughter alive. For the rest of his life, until his death from a heart attack in 2012, Thomas Hartwell would replay that morning in his mind, would search for something he'd missed, some sign of what was coming, some way he could have prevented it. There was nothing. It was just an ordinary morning, until it wasn't. School was unremarkable that day, as far as anyone could reconstruct later. Jennifer attended all her classes. English first period with Mrs. Davidson, where they were reading Romeo and Juliet and discussing the nature of young love, which had made Jennifer blush because she kept thinking about Marcus. Then world history with Mr. Chen, where they were studying the Industrial Revolution and its impact on American cities like Detroit. Algebra with Ms. Rodriguez, where Marcus sat behind her, and Jennifer kept glancing back at him, trying to work up the courage to give him the Valentine's card, but losing her nerve each time. Chemistry with Dr. Patterson, biology with Mrs. Kowalski, gym class where they were playing volleyball, and Jennifer had been on the winning team. She sat with her friends at lunch, Ashley Morrison, Keisha Johnson, and Sarah Chen, at their usual table near the windows in the cafeteria. They talked about Valentine's, day plans, about which boys they liked, about the upcoming winter dance in March. Jennifer traded half her sandwich for Ashley Morrison's chips like she did most days, like they'd been doing since freshman year, when they'd discovered they both hated what their mothers packed them. Ashley would remember this lunch with excruciating detail, would remember that Jennifer had been excited about band practice that afternoon because they were working on a new piece, something with a complicated clarinet solo that Jennifer was determined to master. Except band practice never happened. She had clarinet practice after school, scheduled from 3 to 4:30 like it was every Wednesday. But it was cancelled because Mr. Henderson, the band director, had the flu. He'd called the school that morning, his voice raspy and weak, and told them he wouldn't be in. A notice had been posted on the band room door, but not all students had seen it. Some had still shown up, had found the locked door and the hastily written sign, and had left. But Jennifer had 7th period free, which she usually spent in the library doing homework before band practice. She'd seen the notice earlier in the day, when she'd gone to put her clarinet in the bandroom locker. This was the deviation, the small change in routine that meant Jennifer left school at 2:40 instead of 4:30. This was the crack in the normal pattern of her day that created the opportunity for horror. If Mr. Henderson hadn't been sick, if band practice had happened as scheduled, Jennifer would have stayed at school until 4:30. She would have walked out with dozens of other students, would have caught the later bus home with her friends from band. She would have made it home safely. She would have had dinner with her family, would have done her homework, would have gone to bed and woken up the next morning. She would have turned 16 the following August. She would have graduated high school. She would have gone to college. She would have become a veterinarian. She would have had a life. But band practice was cancelled, and so Jennifer's life ended at 15. She stopped at her locker to get her coat and backpack. Her locker was number 247 on the 2nd floor in the West Wing, decorated inside with pictures of her friends, of her cat Whiskers, of horses, because she loved horses, even though she'd never ridden one. Multiple witnesses saw her leave through the main entrance at 2:47. Jamie Peterson, a junior, was sitting on the front steps waiting for his older brother to pick him up, and he remembered seeing Jennifer walk past, remembered noticing her white Keds with the red hearts, thought it was kind of cute in a dorky way. Lisa Martinez, a teacher's aide, was walking to her car in the parking lot and saw Jennifer heading down the sidewalk toward Fairview Avenue. The school security camera caught her walking across the parking lot, the footage grainy and washed, out like all security footage from 1996, but clear enough to show Jennifer adjusting her backpack straps, shifting the weight on her shoulders, then turning left on Fairview Avenue. That footage would be replayed hundreds of times over the years, would be shown on local news broadcasts and true crime programs, would become seared into the collective memory of everyone who knew Jennifer Hartwell. Investigators would analyze every frame, looking for anything unusual, anyone following her, any cars slowing down. They would find nothing. The last image on that security tape is Jennifer Hartwell walking away from the camera, her ponytail swinging as she walked, her backpack on both shoulders, her white Keds with red hearts visible for just a moment before she disappeared from view. What happened next would have to be reconstructed from evidence, from forensics, from the careful piecing together of fragments, and the best guesses of experienced investigators who had seen too many cases like this. Jennifer walked north on Fairview Avenue, a street she knew well, a route she'd walked before. The bus she normally took, the number 12 that would have carried her home, wasn't due for another 23 minutes. It was scheduled to arrive at the Fairview and max stop at 3:10. In February in Detroit, the temperature was hovering around 34 degrees, cold, but not bitter, grey sky threatening snow that wouldn't arrive until evening. The weather forecast had called for flurries overnight, 3 to 5 inches by morning. It was cold enough to make waiting at a bus stop uncomfortable, cold enough that standing still would quickly become miserable. Investigators believed Jennifer decided to walk part of the way, maybe to kill time, maybe to warm up through movement, maybe just because she felt like walking. She'd done it before, her mother said later. When the weather was decent and she wasn't in a hurry, Jennifer sometimes walked the first several blocks and caught the bus closer to home at one of the later stops along the route. It was a safe neighborhood in 1996, or at least it had seemed safe. Safe enough that a teenage girl walking alone in broad daylight didn't trigger alarm. Safe enough that parents didn't worry about their children being outside. Safe enough that what happened next seemed impossible, seemed like something that happened in other places, to other families, not here, not in their neighborhood, not to their children. Somewhere between Fairview Avenue and Mack Avenue, a distance of roughly 6 blocks, maybe 10 minutes of walking, Jennifer Hartwell encountered her killer. There were no witnesses to this meeting, no security cameras in that area, no businesses with surveillance systems, no homeowners who happened to be looking out their windows at exactly the right moment to see what happened, no one who remembered seeing a burgundy sweater, a teenage girl with a backpack and a ponytail, a man who shouldn't have been there. The investigation would later determine, through the location and condition of her body and the forensic evidence collected, that she was approached by someone in a vehicle, that she either got into that vehicle willingly, perhaps because she knew the person, perhaps because they offered her a ride home on a cold day, perhaps because they seemed safe and non-threatening, or was forced into it through threats or physical coercion. She was driven to an abandoned warehouse on Russell Street, a building that had once housed a tool and die company called Precision Manufacturing, but had been vacant for 3 years, its windows broken out by vandals and weather, its doors secured with chains that someone had cut through sometime in the weeks or months before February 14, 1996. The building was scheduled for demolition that spring. It would never happen. After Jennifer's body was found there, the building became part of a crime scene, then, eventually, a memorial, and it would stand for 7 more years before finally being torn down in 2003. Jennifer was sexually assaulted in that building, in a second-floor office that still had a desk pushed against one wall, and a dented filing cabinet and a wall calendar from 1993 showing June, someone's vacation month circled in red marker. The medical examiner would later determine that the assault was violent, that Jennifer had fought back. There was skin under her fingernails, bruising on her arms consistent with defensive wounds, evidence that she had struggled against her attacker. She was strangled. Manual strangulation, the medical examiner's report would say, using terminology that made horror sound clinical. Cause of death, asphyxiation due to compression of the neck. Time of death, estimated between 3:30 and 5:30 p.m. on February 14, 1996, based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and stomach contents that showed she hadn't eaten since lunch at school. Her body was left in that second-floor office, left on the dusty floor beneath the window, left where anyone might find her, or where she might lie undiscovered for days or weeks. Her backpack was found near her body, its contents scattered, textbooks, notebooks, pens, the Valentine's card she'd bought for Marcus, still in its envelope, never given. Her white Keds were still on her feet, the red hearts she'd drawn the night before now evidence, now photographed and catalogued and preserved. She was 15 years old. She'd been alive for 15 years, 3 months and 2 days. She would never turn 16. She would never graduate high school. She would never become a veterinarian. She would never get married or have children. She would never grow old. Everything she might have been, every dream she'd harbored, every plan she'd made, ended in that abandoned office on a cold February afternoon, while the world continued on around her, unaware, uncaring, until someone finally found her 2 days later. Patricia. Hartwell got home from her shift at the hospital at 6:20 p.m. on February 14th. She'd worked a double shift, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., had been on her feet all day, dealing with the usual chaos of a busy urban hospital. She was tired, looking forward to dinner, and maybe watching some TV with her family before bed. She expected Jennifer to be home already, expected to find her doing homework at the kitchen table or watching television in the living room. Jennifer wasn't there. This wasn't immediately alarming. Band practice sometimes ran late, or maybe Jennifer had gone to Ashley's house, or maybe she'd stopped at the library. But there was a prickling awareness at the back of Patricia's mind, an instinct that something wasn't quite right. She couldn't have articulated what it was, just a mother's sense that something was off. By 7 o'clock, when Jennifer still hadn't come home and wasn't answering her pager, Patricia had paged her twice, entering their home number followed by 911, their family code for call home immediately. The worry began to crystallize into something more concrete, something with weight and substance. Patricia called Jennifer's closest friends. Ashley Morrison hadn't seen Jennifer since lunch. Keisha Johnson said the same thing. Sarah Chen mentioned that band practice had been cancelled, that she'd seen the notice on the door and assumed Jennifer had seen it too, assumed Jennifer had just gone home early. Patricia called the school, got the night janitor who knew nothing about student schedules. She called Thomas at work, caught him just as his shift was ending, told him Jennifer wasn't home, and she was starting to worry. Thomas said he'd come straight home, said not to panic yet. There was probably a simple explanation. But his voice sounded uncertain, carried an edge that Patricia recognized as fear barely contained. By 7:30, Patricia was calling all of Jennifer's friends again, asking more detailed questions, trying to establish a timeline. When was the last time anyone saw Jennifer? Who had she talked to? Did she mention plans? Did she say where she was going? Everyone said the same thing. They'd seen her at school. She'd seemed normal. She'd left after 7th period because band practice was cancelled. No one knew where she'd gone after that. At 8:15, with darkness fully settled over Detroit and the temperature dropping and her daughter still not home, Patricia Hartwell called the police. She dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she had to try twice to get the numbers right. And when the dispatcher answered, Patricia said, "My daughter didn't come home from school. Something's wrong. I need help." The responding officers arrived at 8:40 p.m., 2 patrol officers in their late 20s who'd probably been hoping for a quiet night. They took a report, asked questions, wrote down Jennifer's description in their notebooks. 15 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, approximately 110 pounds, brown hair in a ponytail, blue eyes, last seen wearing jeans and a burgundy sweater and white keds with red hearts drawn on them. They asked if Jennifer had ever run away before. Patricia said no, never. They asked if there were problems at home, conflicts with her parents. Patricia said no. Jennifer was a good kid, a happy kid. There were no problems. They asked about boyfriends, if Jennifer might have gone off with a boy somewhere. Patricia mentioned Marcus, said they'd gone on a few chaperoned dates but nothing serious, that Jennifer wouldn't just disappear without telling anyone. The officers nodded, took notes, and said these things usually resolved themselves, that teenage girls sometimes stayed out late without permission, that Jennifer would probably turn up soon. But Patricia could see in their eyes that they didn't really believe their own reassurances, could see that they were worried too, that the absence of a 15-year-old girl on a cold February night was serious, was dangerous, was every parent's nightmare made real. Thomas Hartwell, who'd come home from his shift to find his wife on the phone with police, felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd had that same feeling once before, years ago, when his own father had died suddenly of a heart attack. It was a feeling of the world shifting, of something fundamental changing, of reality becoming unfamiliar and threatening. This wasn't like Jennifer. Jennifer didn't stay out without calling. Jennifer didn't break rules. Jennifer was responsible, reliable, the kind of kid who always did her homework and kept her promises and came home when she was supposed to. Thomas stood in their living room, watching the police officers write in their notebooks, watching his wife twist her hands together, and he knew. He couldn't have explained how he knew, but he did. Something terrible had happened to his daughter. By midnight, when Jennifer still hadn't come home, when her pager had been going off unanswered for hours, when none of her friends had heard from her, and no hospital in the area had any record of a Jennifer Hartwell being admitted, patrol units were searching the neighborhood, driving slowly down residential streets with their spotlights sweeping yards and alleys, calling Jennifer's name into the darkness. Patricia and Thomas Hartwell sat at their kitchen table, not speaking, just waiting, existing in that terrible liminal space between hope and despair, between not knowing and the dreadful certainty that they were about to know something they wished they never had to know. By morning, when the grey February dawn broke over Detroit and Jennifer still hadn't come home, her photo was on the news. Local stations ran the story during their morning broadcasts. 15-year-old girl missing since yesterday afternoon. Last seen leaving Southeastern High School. Anyone with information, please call Detroit Police. The phone number scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Tips started coming in immediately, dozens of them, hundreds by the end of the day. None of them led anywhere. They found her on February 16th, 2 days after she disappeared, 46 hours after Thomas Hartwell had watched his daughter walk down the driveway toward the bus stop. 46 hours of searching and waiting and slowly dying inside. A homeless man named Dennis Kowalski had been looking for a place to sleep out of the cold. He was 47 years old, had been living on the streets for 3 years since losing his job and his apartment, surviving through a combination of shelters and abandoned buildings and the charity of strangers. On the morning of February 16th, with the temperature in the low 20s and snow starting to fall, Kowalski had been looking for shelter. He'd pushed through the broken chain on the warehouse door at Russell Street, had entered the dark building that smelled of rust and neglect, and something else, something wrong that he couldn't quite identify. He'd made his way upstairs, looking for a spot away from the wind, maybe a room with some walls still intact. He'd found Jennifer's body in that second-floor office. Later, he would tell police that he'd known immediately what he was looking at, that there was no mistaking a dead body for anything else, that the girl had been lying on her back with her eyes open and her hands at her sides, and he'd known she was someone's daughter, someone's child, and that someone needed to know where she was. Kowalski had left the building immediately, had flagged down a patrol car 2 blocks away, had told the officers what he'd found. They'd radioed for detectives, for the medical examiner, for crime scene technicians. They'd secured the scene, stringing yellow tape across the warehouse entrance, posting officers at all access points. Detective Raymond Pierce arrived at 9:30 a.m. Pierce was the lead investigator, 42 years old, a 16-year veteran of Detroit PD who'd worked dozens of homicides, who'd seen things that most people couldn't imagine, who'd developed the kind of professional detachment necessary to function in homicide investigation. But standing in that abandoned office, looking at Jennifer Hartwell's body, looking at her white keds with the hand-drawn hearts, looking at her face that should have been animated with teenage energy and was instead empty and still, Pierce felt something crack in his chest. She looked younger than 15. She looked like she could have been his own daughter, who was 13 and safe at home, and would never walk anywhere alone again if Pierce had anything to say about it. He stood there for a long moment, looking at Jennifer Hartwell, and he made her a promise. He didn't say it out loud, but he made it nonetheless. Made it to her and to himself, and to whatever forces govern justice in an unjust world. He would find who did this. He would not stop until he found who did this. Pierce would work this case until he retired in 2009. 13 years of reviewing files and following leads, and never quite letting it go. He would never stop thinking about Jennifer Hartwell, about the girl with the hand-drawn hearts on her shoes. He would die in 2018 at age 64, of cancer, without seeing the case solved, but his promise would eventually be kept, just not by him. The initial investigation was thorough and aggressive, the kind of full-court press that happens when a child is murdered, when a community demands answers and police departments deploy every available resource. More than 40 officers were assigned to the case in the first week alone, working 16-hour shifts, following up on every tip, every lead, every whisper of information. They canvassed the neighborhood around the school, knocking on every door, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual on February 14th between 2:40 and 5:30 p.m. They canvassed the neighborhood around the warehouse, asking the same questions. They canvassed Jennifer's neighborhood, showing her photo, asking if anyone had seen her, if anyone had noticed any suspicious vehicles or people. They interviewed hundreds of people, all of Jennifer's classmates, all of her teachers, family friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen something, heard something, known something. They collected Jennifer's schoolwork, her diary, her notes from Marcus, looking for any indication of trouble, of secrets, of threats, of someone she might have been afraid of or involved with. They found nothing. Jennifer's diary was exactly what you'd expect from a 15-year-old girl. Entries about her friends, about school, about her feelings for Marcus, about wanting to be a veterinarian, about normal teenage concerns and dreams and worries. There were no secrets, no hidden relationships, no indication that anyone was threatening her or bothering her. Jennifer's life was exactly what it appeared to be: normal, happy, uncomplicated, which made what happened to her even more incomprehensible, even more terrifying, because if it could happen to Jennifer Hartwell, who had done nothing wrong, who had no enemies, who was just a normal kid living a normal life, then it could happen to anyone. The forensic evidence was more promising, at least initially. Jennifer's body showed signs of sexual assault, evidence that was carefully documented and collected by the medical examiner and crime scene technicians who spent hours at the warehouse processing every inch of that second-floor office. They collected DNA evidence from the crime scene, samples that were carefully preserved and catalogued according to strict chain-of-custody protocols. In 1996, DNA analysis was still relatively new in law enforcement, expensive and time-consuming, not yet the routine tool it would become. The samples were sent to the Michigan State Police Forensics Lab in Lansing, where technicians extracted and amplified the genetic material, building a profile of the unknown subject. The process took weeks. When the results finally came back, they confirmed what investigators already knew. The DNA belonged to a male, someone who was not related to Jennifer, someone who was not in the system. They yielded a male DNA profile that was clear and complete and utterly useless without something to compare it to. The problem was that there was no match in any database. CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, had only been operational for about a year and contained relatively few profiles, mostly violent offenders who'd been convicted and sampled in states with DNA collection laws. Whoever had killed Jennifer Hartwell either had no prior convictions or had committed his crimes before DNA collection became standard. The DNA profile sat in evidence, carefully stored at the Michigan State Police Lab, waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for the person it belonged to enter the system somehow, waiting for a breakthrough that wouldn't come for 28 years. Investigators developed a list of suspects based on opportunity, access, and behavioral indicators. They looked at registered sex offenders in the area. There were 17 within a 5-mile radius of the crime scene, men with prior convictions for sexual assault, rape, or crimes against children. Each one was interviewed, their whereabouts on February 14th established and verified, alibis checked and rechecked. Some were asked to provide DNA samples, were given the choice to volunteer or wait for a warrant. Most volunteered, perhaps out of genuine innocence, perhaps out of a desire to appear cooperative. The samples were tested against the crime scene DNA. None matched. They looked at people in Jennifer's life, starting with those closest to her and working outward. Teachers, coaches, family friends, neighbors, anyone who had regular contact with Jennifer, anyone who might have had opportunity and access. The band director, Mr. Henderson, came under scrutiny because band practice had been cancelled that day, creating the window of opportunity. The fact that he'd called in sick that morning, that he hadn't been at school, seemed suspicious until investigators confirmed that he'd been home sick with the flu, that his wife had been with him all day, that he'd seen a doctor that morning at 10 a.m. and been prescribed antibiotics for a sinus infection. His alibi was solid. His DNA didn't match. They looked at Marcus Washington, the boy Jennifer had liked, the boy she'd been planning to give a Valentine's card to. Marcus had been in detention until 4:30 that day for talking back to his English teacher. A dozen witnesses could confirm this, including the teacher who'd supervised detention. He'd been nowhere near Jennifer when she disappeared. His DNA didn't match. They looked at Jennifer's brothers, Michael and David, standard procedure in any case, because family members are often involved in crimes, even though the idea seemed absurd given the clear evidence of sexual assault and the brothers' obvious grief. Both had solid alibis. Michael had been at work at an auto parts store. Time cards and co-workers confirmed this. David had been at basketball practice at his own high school across town. The coach and teammates confirmed this. Their DNA didn't match. They looked at strangers, at the randomness of predatory violence, at the possibility that this was a crime of opportunity, that Jennifer had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, that she'd encountered someone who was trolling for victims and found her. By March 1996, 6 weeks after Jennifer's murder, the investigation was stalling. Every lead went nowhere. Every promising tip evaporated under scrutiny. Every suspect was cleared. The DNA sat in evidence, useless without a match. The community was terrified. Parents walked their children to and from school, even high school students who would normally resist such coddling. The streets that had been full of kids playing became empty and watchful. No one let their children outside alone. No one trusted the safety that had seemed so natural just weeks before. Attendance at Southeastern High School dropped as parents pulled their children out, enrolled them elsewhere, moved out of the neighborhood entirely. Property values declined. Businesses struggled as people avoided the area. The neighborhood changed, became defined by the tragedy, by the fear, by the knowledge that a monster had walked among them and might still be there. At Jennifer's funeral, held on February 22nd at St. Clair of Montefalco Church, more than 600 people attended. The church, which could hold 400 comfortably, couldn't contain them all. People stood in the aisles, in the vestibule, outside on the church steps in the cold. They came to mourn, to remember, to bear witness, to stand in solidarity with the Hartwell family. Patricia Hartwell sat in the front pew between her husband and her 2 sons. And she didn't cry because she'd already cried everything she had cried until her body was empty, until there were no more tears left, until she felt hollowed out and numb. She sat through the service, like she was watching it happen to someone else, like she was floating somewhere above her body, detached and distant. Thomas Hartwell held her hand so tightly that his knuckles went white, held on like he was afraid she might disappear too, like if he just held on tight enough, he could keep what was left of his family together. Father Michael Donovan, who'd baptized Jennifer 15 years earlier, who'd known her since she was an infant, struggled through his homily. He spoke about innocence stolen and faith tested, and a community's responsibility to remember, but his voice kept breaking, kept catching on tears he was trying to hold back. The casket at the front of the church was closed. Patricia had insisted on this. She didn't want people's last memory of her daughter to be her death. She wanted them to remember Jennifer alive, laughing, full of energy and dreams. After the funeral, After Jennifer was buried at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, in a plot that Thomas and Patricia had purchased, along with two others for themselves, thinking they'd be using them 30 or 40 years in the future. Not now, not yet, not for their child. The Hartwells went home to their house on Fairmont Street, where Jennifer's room waited unchanged. Patricia couldn't bring herself to touch anything in that room. Jennifer's homework was still on her desk. Her bed was still unmade from that last morning when she'd been in a hurry to get ready. Her stuffed animals still sat on their shelves, Peanut, the elephant, in the place of honor. The room smelled like Jennifer's strawberry shampoo and the vanilla body spray she liked. Patricia closed the door and didn't open it again for weeks. When she finally did, the room still smelled like Jennifer, and Patricia stood in the doorway and cried until Thomas found her and led her away. The room would stay unchanged for years, a shrine to a life interrupted, to dreams that would never be realized. Peanut, the elephant, would remain on that shelf for the next 28 years, watching over an empty room, waiting for someone who would never come home. Detective Raymond Pierce didn't give up. Even as the case grew cold, even as weeks turned to months, and months turned to years, and new cases demanded his attention, Pierce kept working Jennifer's case. He couldn't let it go. It haunted him, the way certain cases haunt certain detectives, the way unsolved murders can become obsessions. He reviewed the files regularly, sometimes late at night at his kitchen table while his wife slept, going through witness statements and forensic reports and photographs, looking for patterns they might have missed, for connections that weren't obvious, for that one detail that would break the case open. He looked for similar crimes, other cases that might have the same MO, other victims who might have been killed by the same person. He found several unsolved murders of young women in the Detroit area during the 1990s, some with similarities to Jennifer's case, but none that matched closely enough to establish a pattern. The DNA profiles, when they existed, didn't match. He reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit for a profile of the perpetrator, hoping that understanding the kind of person who would commit this crime might help identify suspects. The profile came back with information that was both specific and uselessly broad. They were looking for a white male, probably between 25 and 45 years old, likely with some previous criminal history or history of violence, but possibly with no official record if he'd never been caught before. Someone familiar with the area who knew about the abandoned warehouse, who knew the neighborhood, who'd probably scouted locations in advance. Someone organized enough to avoid leaving obvious evidence, but disorganized enough to leave the body rather than concealing it more carefully, suggesting this might have been his first murder, or an opportunistic crime rather than something carefully planned. Someone who might appear normal in his daily life, who might hold down a job, maintain relationships, pass for ordinary. The profile suggested he probably had difficulty with intimate relationships, possibly had a history of failed relationships or marriages, possibly lived alone or with parents. He likely had a vehicle, was comfortable driving in the area. He might have inserted himself into the investigation, might have attended the funeral or memorial services, might have followed the news coverage closely. He might seem helpful, eager to volunteer information, but would be evasive about his own whereabouts and activities. The profile was based on decades of research into similar crimes, but it was still essentially guesswork, probability rather than certainty. It described a type of person, a psychological sketch, but it didn't point to any specific individual. It could have described 10,000 men in Detroit. It was both helpful and useless, gave investigators something to look for, but no concrete way to find it. By 1997, the case was officially cold, not closed. Murdered children's cases are never closed, remain open indefinitely until solved. But cold, meaning there were no active leads, no current investigative activity, the file relegated to a drawer in the cold case room, where it would sit alongside hundreds of other unsolved homicides. Pierce still worked it when he could, but new cases demanded attention, fresh murders with active leads that had to take priority. The file went into storage, into that purgatory where unsolved cases wait. But Patricia and Thomas Hartwell didn't move on, because how could they? How do you move on from your daughter being murdered? How do you go back to normal life when normal life doesn't exist anymore? When the center of your world has been ripped out? When every holiday and birthday and ordinary Tuesday is a reminder of absence, of loss, of the life your child should have been living? They attended every support group meeting for families of homicide victims at a church basement in Dearborn, sitting in folding chairs in a circle with other parents and siblings and spouses who'd lost someone to violence, sharing their grief with people who understood because they'd been through it too. Patricia became an advocate, testifying before the state legislature about funding for victim services, speaking at vigils and rallies, keeping Jennifer's name in the public consciousness, refusing to let her daughter become just another statistic, another unsolved case, another forgotten victim. She appeared on local news broadcasts on the anniversary of Jennifer's death, appealing for information, asking anyone who knew anything to come forward. She created a scholarship fund in Jennifer's name for students pursuing veterinary medicine, giving money to help other young people achieve the dream her daughter had been denied. She needed to do something, needed to feel like Jennifer's death meant something beyond just tragedy, beyond just loss. Every February 14th, Valentine's Day, the anniversary of Jennifer's death, the Hartwells held a memorial at the spot where Jennifer's body had been found. The warehouse was eventually demolished in 2003, the city citing public safety concerns and the need to clear the property for redevelopment that never happened. But they put up a small marker before the demolition, a plaque with Jennifer's name and dates and a simple inscription, "Forever remembered, forever loved." Every year on February 14th, the Hartwells gathered there with anyone who wanted to remember, anyone who refused to let Jennifer be forgotten. Sometimes dozens came, former classmates, teachers, neighbors, people from the support group, strangers who'd followed the case and felt compelled to honor this girl they'd never met. Sometimes just the family came, just Patricia and Thomas and Michael and David, standing in the cold with flowers and candles, speaking Jennifer's name into the winter air, keeping her memory alive through sheer force of will. They never missed a year, not once. Not even after Thomas died in 2012, when Patricia came with her sons and grandchildren who'd never met Jennifer but knew her through stories, through photographs, through the absence that shaped their family. They never missed a year, because to miss a year would be to let Jennifer slip away, to let her become forgotten, and they couldn't allow that, wouldn't allow that, not ever. Robert Mitchell graduated from Wayne State University in 1987 with a master's degree in counseling psychology. His thesis had been on adolescent development and identity formation, a perfectly respectable piece of academic work that his advisor had praised for its insight and empathy. He'd written about how teenagers navigate the transition from childhood to adulthood, how they develop their sense of self, how important it is for adults in their lives to provide guidance and support during this vulnerable time. Reading it years later, knowing what he would do, the words would seem like mockery, like a predator studying his prey with clinical detachment, while masquerading as a caregiver. He got his first job as a guidance counselor at Finney High School in Detroit in 1989, beating out 17 other candidates for the position. The principal who hired him, Margaret Caldwell, would later tell investigators that Mitchell had been an impressive candidate, articulate and personable, with strong academic credentials and glowing references from his graduate school supervisors. He talked about his passion for helping young people, about wanting to make a difference in students' lives, about being someone they could trust and come to with their problems. He was good at his job, by all accounts. Students liked him. He had an easy manner, a way of making teenagers feel heard and understood. of taking their concerns seriously, rather than dismissing them as trivial adolescent drama. He advised them on college applications, helped them navigate family problems, wrote recommendation letters that were thoughtful and personalized, letters that genuinely seemed to care about these young people and their futures. Parents liked him too. He was professional, responsive, seemed genuinely invested in their children's well-being. He attended school events, stayed late to meet with students who needed extra help, volunteered to chaperone dances and field trips. He was, by every external measure, exactly what a guidance counselor should be. He married Sharon Kowalski in 1991. They'd met at a wedding. Sharon was the bride's college roommate. Robert was the groom's cousin. They talked at the reception, discovered they both loved hiking and old movies and Thai food. They dated for 8 months before Robert proposed. Sharon would later tell investigators that he'd been a good husband in those early years, attentive and considerate, that she'd had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. They had 3 children, a daughter, Emma, born in 1992, twin boys, Connor and Ryan, born in 1995. The family lived in a subdivision in Warren, Michigan, a suburb north of Detroit, in a split-level house with a 2-car garage and a fenced backyard. Robert Mitchell coached Emma's soccer team, attending practices and games, cheering from the sidelines, organizing end-of-season pizza parties. He volunteered at their church, Holy Family Catholic Church, helping with the youth ministry, chaperoning retreats, leading discussion groups. He attended PTA meetings at his children's schools, served on the committee that organized the annual fundraiser. He had friends, neighbors who'd come over for barbecues, co-workers he'd go out for drinks with after work. He went to his kids' school plays and piano recitals. He helped Connor and Ryan with their homework. He took family vacations to Mackinac Island and Cedar Point. In every external way, he was living an utterly conventional, respectable life. He was a dedicated father, a faithful husband, a valued member of his community. No one suspected, no one had any idea, because Robert Mitchell was very, very good at hiding what he was. On February 14, 1996, Robert Mitchell called in sick to work at Finney High School. He called the school secretary, Mrs. Henderson, no relation to the band director, at 7:15 in the morning, his voice suitably hoarse and miserable. He told her he had food poisoning, thought it might have been something he'd eaten at a restaurant the night before. Wouldn't be in that day, maybe not tomorrow either. Mrs. Henderson made sympathetic noises, told him to feel better, said she'd let the principal know, and arrange for a substitute to cover his appointments. His wife Sharon was at home with their 8-month-old twin boys, Connor and Ryan, who were teething and fussy. Robert told her he was going to the doctor to get something for the food poisoning, then maybe to his mother's house to rest where it would be quieter, where the baby's crying wouldn't make his supposed nausea worse. Sharon, dealing with 2 crying infants, and probably grateful for a few hours of peace, told him to feel better, told him to call if he needed anything. Robert left the house at 1:30 in the afternoon, wearing jeans and a dark jacket, driving his blue 1994 Honda Accord. He didn't go to a doctor. He didn't go to his mother's house. His mother, who lived in Roseville, would later tell police she hadn't seen Robert that day, hadn't even known he was sick. Security footage from a gas station on Gratiot Avenue, footage that wouldn't be discovered until 2024, when investigators were reviewing old surveillance tapes looking for any images of Mitchell's vehicle, showed Robert Mitchell filling up his blue Honda Accord at 2:18 p.m., less than 2 miles from Southeastern High School. He was alone in the vehicle. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to confirm the time, the vehicle, and Mitchell's identity. At some point, between 2:47, when Jennifer Hartwell left school, and 3:30, the earliest the medical examiner believed she was killed, Robert Mitchell encountered her, abducted her, drove her to that warehouse, and murdered her. The exact mechanics of the encounter would never be fully known. Did he see her walking and make an opportunistic decision? Had he been hunting, looking for someone? Had he seen Jennifer before, at school events or in the neighborhood, and targeted her specifically? The truth died with Jennifer and lives only in Robert Mitchell's mind, and he has never confessed, never explained, never offered any insight into his motivations or his methods. After murdering Jennifer Hartwell, Robert Mitchell drove home. He stopped at a grocery store and bought ginger ale and crackers, the kind of things someone with food poisoning might buy. He got home around 6:30, told Sharon he was feeling a little better, thanked her for handling the boys all day. He had dinner with his family, chicken and rice, something bland for his supposedly upset stomach. He helped give Connor and Ryan their bath, laughing when they splashed water everywhere. He read Emma a bedtime story, kissed her good night. He went to bed next to his wife and slept. While the Hartwells were frantic with worry, while Jennifer's body lay in that cold warehouse, while detectives were beginning to mobilize a massive search, Robert Mitchell slept. What makes a person capable of this? This is the question that haunts every case like Jennifer's, the question without adequate answer. Robert Mitchell had no prior criminal record, no history of violence that anyone knew about, no red flags that anyone could see, no warning signs that might have predicted what he would do. The psychiatric evaluation conducted after his arrest in 2024 would diagnose him as having antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic traits, a clinical term that barely captures the capacity for compartmentalization required to murder a teenage girl and then return home to read bedtime stories to your own children. The psychologist's report, submitted to the court as part of the sentencing process, noted Mitchell's complete lack of remorse, his inability to empathize with his victims, both Jennifer and his own family, who'd been deceived for nearly 3 decades. The report noted his ability to rationalize his actions, to minimize the harm he'd caused, to maintain a self-image as a good person, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The report noted his view of Jennifer as an object rather than a person, as something that existed for his gratification rather than as a human being with her own thoughts and feelings and rights. These clinical observations are useful for legal purposes, for establishing mental state and culpability, but they don't really explain anything. They just attach vocabulary to incomprehensibility, give names to horrors that defy understanding. How does a person develop the ability to hurt others without remorse? Some combination of nature and nurture, of genetic predisposition and environmental factors and choices made along the way? No one really knows. Psychology and neuroscience can describe patterns, can identify correlations, can point to brain structures and childhood experiences that are associated with violent behavior. But they can't really explain the fundamental question of how a human being becomes capable of taking another human being's life for no reason beyond their own desires. The truth is that some people are broken in ways that can't be fixed, are wired in ways that make them dangerous to others, and the best we can do is identify them and keep them away from potential victims. Robert Mitchell was one of those people, and for 28 years, no one knew. Robert Mitchell's life continued normally after February 14, 1996. He went back to work at Finney High School, returned on February 16th, with apologies for missing 2 days, saying the food poisoning had been brutal, but he was feeling better now. He sat in his office and met with students, offered advice and support, wrote recommendation letters, attended faculty meetings. He watched the news coverage of Jennifer Hartwell's murder, listened to colleagues discuss the tragedy, participated in conversations about school safety and protecting students. The principal held an assembly to address Jennifer's death, to provide counselors for students who wanted to talk, to reassure parents that the school was safe. Robert Mitchell attended that assembly. He sat in the auditorium with other faculty and staff and listened to the principal talk about Jennifer, about how she was a member of their school community, about how this senseless tragedy had touched them all. He bowed his head during the moment of silence. He signed the condolence card that circulated through the faculty lounge, wrote a brief message about how Jennifer would be missed. He donated to the scholarship fund that Patricia Hartwell established. He went to Jennifer's memorial service at the school, stood with other teachers and staff in the gymnasium, where they'd set up a display of photos and mementos, where students could write messages and share memories. He looked at Jennifer's smiling face in those photographs, at the girl he'd murdered, and he felt nothing. Or perhaps he felt satisfaction, pride in having gotten away with it, the thrill of being present at his victim's memorial while everyone around him grieved, completely unaware that the person who'd destroyed Jennifer was standing right there among them. In 1998, Robert Mitchell was named Counselor of the Year by the Detroit Public Schools District, an award that recognized his dedication to students and excellence in his field. He attended an award ceremony, shook hands with the superintendent, posed for a photo holding his plaque. The photo ran in the Detroit News Education section. Jennifer Hartwell had been dead for 2 years. In 2002, Mitchell transferred to Cody High School, another large urban school on Detroit's northwest side. He spent 8 years there, continuing to counsel students, continuing to be well regarded by colleagues and parents. In 2010, he took early retirement at age 54, citing stress and a desire to spend more time with his grandchildren. His daughter Emma had married and had 2 children of her own. His twin sons, Connor and Ryan, both attended college. Connor became an engineer. Ryan became a teacher like his father, working with elementary school students. The family was close. They had Sunday dinners together at Sharon and Robert's house. They celebrated holidays together, went on vacations together, supported each other through life's ups and downs. Robert Mitchell appeared to be a devoted father and grandfather, a respected former educator, a pillar of his community, and the entire time he carried the knowledge of what he'd done to Jennifer Hartwell. The entire time he knew. The entire time he said nothing. The entire time, while Patricia Hartwell held memorial services and gave interviews and testified before the legislature, while Thomas Hartwell's health declined under the weight of grief, while Jennifer's brothers struggled with survivor's guilt and the knowledge that they couldn't protect their sister, while the case sat cold in a file. Robert Mitchell went about his life, secure in the belief that he would never be caught, that forensic science in 1996 wasn't sophisticated enough to identify him, that he'd been too careful, too smart. And for 28 years, he was right. The breakthrough came from genealogical DNA testing, a technology that didn't exist in 1996, that wasn't even imaginable to the investigators working Jennifer's case. This technology, which allows law enforcement to compare crime scene DNA to genetic genealogy databases built by services like GED Match and Family Tree DNA, had been successfully used to solve several cold cases since 2018, most famously the Golden State Killer case in California, where a serial killer and rapist who'd terrorized communities for decades was finally identified and arrested after evading capture for more than 40 years. The technique involves uploading a DNA profile from a crime scene to public genealogy databases, where people have submitted their own DNA for ancestry research, then using the partial matches from distant relatives to build out a family tree, following lineages forward and backward through generations, until arriving at a potential suspect. It's painstaking work that combines genetics with traditional genealogical research, requiring expertise in both fields. In 2023, the Michigan State Police formed a cold case unit specifically focused on leveraging this new technology, allocating funding and personnel to review unsolved cases where DNA evidence had been collected but never matched to a suspect. Jennifer Hartwell's case was one of the first they selected for review. The DNA sample from 1996 was still in evidence storage at the State Police Lab in Lansing, carefully preserved in a freezer, its chain of custody meticulously documented. The sample had been well preserved, kept at proper temperature, never contaminated or compromised. It was viable for testing. In January 2024, forensic genealogist Dr. Rebecca Chen began building a family tree using the crime scene DNA. Dr. Chen was 43 years old, held a PhD in genetics from the University of Michigan, and had been working in forensic genealogy for 6 years, had helped solve 12 cold cases in that time. She approached each case the same way, methodically and patiently, understanding that this work couldn't be rushed. She started by uploading the DNA profile from Jennifer's case to GEDmatch, a public database where users have consented to law enforcement searches. The system found several partial matches, third cousins, fourth cousins, distant relatives who shared small segments of DNA with the unknown subject. None of the matches were close enough to directly identify the perpetrator, but they were enough to begin building a family tree. Dr. Chen spent weeks building out family trees for each match, following lineages forward and backward through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, obituaries, church records, newspaper archives, any documentation that could establish relationships and trace families through generations. She was looking for places where family trees overlapped, for common ancestors that might indicate a connection. She was looking for a male in the right age range, based on the original FBI profile, probably between 25 and 45 in 1996, which would make him between 53 and 73 in 2024, who had a connection to Detroit in 1996, who had the opportunity to commit the crime. The work was tedious, requiring attention to detail and persistence, following leads that often went nowhere, building out family trees with hundreds or thousands of individuals, looking for that one person who fit the parameters. By mid-February 2024, Dr. Chen had identified a common ancestor, a couple who'd lived in Michigan in the late 1800s, who appeared in the family trees of multiple matches. She worked forward from that couple, tracing their descendants through 6 generations, building out a massive family tree that included thousands of people, most of whom could be eliminated as suspects based on age, gender, or location. But the tree was narrowing, focusing on specific lineages, specific individuals. By late February 2024, Dr. Chen had narrowed the possibilities to 3 potential candidates, 3 men in the right age range with connections to the Detroit area in 1996. The first was ruled out immediately. Robert Kowalski had died in a car accident in 1993, 3 years before Jennifer's murder. Investigators confirmed his death through death certificate and obituary, confirmed that he was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery. He was not their suspect. The second candidate was serving time in federal prison in Arizona for tax evasion and had been there since 1995, making him impossible as the perpetrator. Investigators confirmed his incarceration through federal prison records, confirmed that he'd been locked up when Jennifer was killed. He was not their suspect. The third was Robert Mitchell. His second cousin, a woman named Linda Mitchell who lived in California, had uploaded DNA to GEDmatch in 2019 while researching their family history, never imagining that this hobby would eventually lead to a killer's identification, never thinking that her DNA would help solve a murder case 5 years later. Dr. Chen built out Mitchell's family tree, confirmed his age. He would have been 39 in 1996, firmly within the FBI profile's age range. She confirmed his residence in the Detroit area in 1996. He'd been living in Warren, working at Finney High School. She confirmed his access to a vehicle. DMV records showed he'd owned a blue 1994 Honda Accord. She presented her findings to the cold case unit in early March. Everything fit. The age was right. The location was right. The opportunity was right. But they needed to confirm the match with a direct DNA sample from Mitchell himself. Genealogical DNA could narrow down candidates, could point investigators in the right direction, but it couldn't definitively identify someone. They needed Mitchell's actual DNA to compare directly to the crime scene sample, and they needed to collect it without alerting him, without giving him any opportunity to flee or destroy evidence. The surveillance was careful and patient. Detectives followed Mitchell, documented his routines, learned his patterns, waited for an opportunity to collect discarded DNA. Michigan law allowed police to collect DNA from items that had been abandoned in public spaces, trash left on a curb, cigarette butts discarded on a sidewalk, cups thrown away in a public trash can. It's considered abandoned property, no longer subject to Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. The detectives following Mitchell needed him to abandon something with his DNA on it in a public space. It came on March 18th, 2024. Mitchell went to Caribou Coffee in Dearborn Heights, his usual Tuesday morning routine that he'd maintained since retirement. He arrived at 8:30 a.m., ordered a medium dark roast with 1 cream and 1 sugar, paid with a credit card that the detectives noted for their records. He sat at a table near the window, in the same seat he always chose, opened the Detroit Free Press that he'd picked up from the rack by the door, and read for 40 minutes. He read the front section first, then sports, then the local news section. He folded the paper neatly when he finished. He drank his coffee slowly, checking his phone occasionally, watching people come and go. At 9:20 a.m., he stood up, threw his empty coffee cup in the trash receptacle near the door, and left. He got into his car, a 2018 Toyota Camry now, the Honda long since replaced, and drove home. An unmarked car followed at a distance. Another detective, a woman named Sarah Kim, who'd been sitting at a table across the coffee shop pretending to work on her laptop, waited 15 minutes after Mitchell left, then walked to the trash receptacle. She reached in, carefully retrieved the coffee cup using gloves, and placed it in an evidence bag. The cup had Mitchell's fingerprints on the outside, and his saliva on the rim where he'd been drinking. It was carefully logged and documented, chain of custody established, then transported to the Michigan State Police lab. The DNA on the cup rim was sent to the lab for expedited analysis. The process that had taken weeks in 1996 now took days. On March 26, 2024, the results came back. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from Jennifer Hartwell's crime scene. The match was conclusive, the certainty level above 99.9%. After 28 years, after 10,227 days, after more than a quarter century of waiting and wondering and working, they had him. They had Jennifer Hartwell's killer. Detective Maria Santos was 12 years old when Jennifer Hartwell was murdered, a fact that made this case feel both professional and deeply personal. She'd grown up in Detroit, in a neighborhood not far from where Jennifer had lived, had attended middle school when Jennifer's murder happened. She remembered the fear that swept through the city that winter, remembered how everything changed after Jennifer died, remembered her own mother's increased vigilance, the way she was suddenly never allowed to walk anywhere alone, the way her mother started driving her to school instead of letting her take the bus, the way the neighborhood that had felt safe suddenly felt dangerous. She remembered Jennifer's photo on the news, remembered thinking that Jennifer looked like someone she could have been friends with, someone normal and regular and completely undeserving of what happened to her. Santos joined Detroit PD in 2008, motivated in part by cases like Jennifer's, by a desire to help families find answers, to stand between predators and potential victims. She made detective in 2016, worked robbery for 2 years, then homicide for another 3. When the cold case unit formed in 2023, she requested assignment immediately. She wanted to work cases like Jennifer's, wanted to give families the closure they'd been denied, wanted to solve the mysteries that had haunted the department for years or decades. Reading through the original case file on Jennifer Hartwell, seeing Raymond Pierce's meticulous notes, his clear dedication to finding justice for this girl, his frustration evident in the margins where he'd scribbled questions and theories, Santos felt the weight of responsibility. Pierce was gone, had died 6 years earlier without seeing this case solved. Jennifer's father, Thomas, had died of a heart attack in 2012, had lived 16 years without knowing who killed his daughter. But Patricia Hartwell was still alive, still waiting for answers after 28 years. Santos picked up her phone on that Tuesday morning in March and called the number that had been in the file since 1996, updated over the years as the Hartwells moved once to a smaller house after Thomas died, as their area code changed when the city redrew phone districts. Patricia Hartwell answered on the third ring, her voice cautious, wary of calls from unknown numbers because she'd received so many over the years, reporters wanting interviews, psychics claiming to have information, pranksters calling with false tips, or worse. Santos identified herself, said she was with Detroit PD Cold Case Unit, asked if Patricia could come to the station. There'd been a development in Jennifer's case, a significant development. The words hung in the air for a long moment. Patricia's breath caught. She asked what kind of development. Santos said she'd rather explain in person, said it was important, said could Patricia come this morning, as soon as possible. Patricia said yes, she'd be there in 30 minutes, and hung up. Santos identified herself. Again, when Patricia arrived at the station, walking through the door with her 2 sons, Michael and David, now men in their 50s with families of their own, but still somehow looking young, and lost in that moment, still somehow the grieving brothers they'd been in 1996. Santos met them in the lobby, shook their hands, led them to a private interview room, a small windowless space with a table and chairs, and a box of tissues that Santos had brought in, because she knew they'd need it. She sat across from them, these people who'd been waiting for 28 years for this conversation, and she told them they'd identified Jennifer's killer through DNA evidence, through new technology that hadn't existed in 1996, through the dedication of forensic genealogist Dr. Rebecca Chen and the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit. She told them his name, Robert Mitchell. She watched their faces carefully, watched for recognition, for any indication that the name meant something to them. But their faces showed only confusion, showed that the name was completely unfamiliar. Patricia asked who Robert Mitchell was. Santos explained. A former guidance counselor, worked at Detroit public schools for 21 years, retired in 2010, had been living in Dearborn Heights. Patricia shook her head. She didn't know him. She asked if they were sure, asked how they could be certain after all these years, asked if there was any possibility of a mistake. Santos showed her the report, explained the science in terms that were accessible without being condescending, explained how genealogical DNA works, how they'd built the family tree, how they'd obtained the confirmatory sample from the coffee cup, how the match was conclusive, how there was no doubt. Patricia sat very still. She didn't cry. She just sat there, absorbing this information, processing what it meant. And then she said, voice flat and hard, 28 years. She repeated it. 28 years he's been walking around free while my daughter is in the ground. Her voice was empty of emotion, or perhaps so full of emotion that it had circled back to flatness, to a place beyond anger or grief or relief. 28 years he's been living his life like nothing happened, like my daughter's life meant nothing, like what he did to her didn't matter. Santos told them they were going to arrest Mitchell that day, told them she wanted them to know before they saw it on the news, wanted them to hear it from her rather than from a television broadcast. Patricia nodded. She asked if she could see a photo of him. Santos pulled it up on her computer. Mitchell's driver's license photo from 2022, showing an ordinary-looking man with grey hair and glasses, pleasant expression, someone you wouldn't look at twice if you passed him on the street. Patricia stared at that face for a long time. Her sons looked over her shoulder, also staring, also trying to reconcile this normal-looking man with the monster who'd murdered their sister. Then Patricia stood up, thanked Santos for telling them, for solving the case, for not giving up, and walked out of the station. She got into her car with her sons and drove home and sat in her living room and waited for the news to break. The arrest would happen in a few hours. The world would know. After 28 years, Jennifer's killer finally had a name. The arrest happened at 11:15 a.m. on March 27, 2024, a carefully choreographed operation involving 6 officers and 2 detectives, planned down to the minute to ensure both safety and compliance with legal procedures. The team approached Robert Mitchell's home in Dearborn Heights, a modest ranch house with beige siding and brown shutters, well-maintained lawn, a bird feeder in the front yard attracting cardinals and blue jays, a garden gnome near the front steps that his granddaughter had given him for his birthday. It looked like the home of someone's grandfather, someone's neighbor, someone ordinary and harmless. 6 patrol cars parked on the street, lights off, no sirens, trying to be discreet, but knowing that neighbors would notice anyway, that this would be all over social media within minutes. Detective Santos and Detective James Morrison walked up to the front door, while the uniformed officers positioned themselves around the perimeter of the house, in case Mitchell tried to flee out a back door or window. Santos knocked. They waited. She could hear someone moving inside, footsteps approaching. The door opened. Robert Mitchell stood there in sweatpants and a University of Michigan t-shirt, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, holding a cup of coffee. He looked confused when the officers identified themselves, looked puzzled rather than afraid, as though he genuinely didn't understand why police would be at his door. Santos identified herself and Detective Morrison, told Mitchell he was under arrest for the murder of Jennifer Marie Hartwell. For just a second, something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or calculation or fear. Something that showed he knew exactly what name they'd just said, even though he tried to maintain his confused expression. Then his expression went blank, went carefully neutral, shut down completely. He didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand to know what this was about, or insist there'd been a mistake. He just stood there as Santos read him his Miranda rights, the words familiar from countless television shows, but strange and surreal when applied to your own arrest, when you're the one standing there in handcuffs. He let them cuff him, his hands behind his back, the metal tight around his wrists. He didn't ask for a lawyer right then, though he would later. He didn't say anything except to ask if he could put shoes on. He was wearing socks, old white athletic socks with a hole forming in one toe. They let him step into sneakers by the door, didn't let him go back into the house to get proper shoes, because they couldn't risk him accessing a weapon or destroying evidence or fleeing. They walked him to the patrol car, while neighbors watched from their yards and windows, while his daughter Emma rushed over from 3 houses down where she lived with her husband and children, her face confused and then horrified as she realized what was happening, as she saw her father in handcuffs being led to a police car. She ran up to the officers, demanding to know what was happening, what her father was supposed to have done, insisting there must be a mistake. Santos told her that Mitchell had been arrested for murder, that he'd be taken to the station for processing, that she should contact an attorney. Emma stood on the sidewalk, watching her father being driven away, watching her entire understanding of her family, her childhood, her life, shatter into incomprehensible fragments. The news helicopters that had gotten wind of the arrest were already circling overhead, cameras filming Mitchell being led to that patrol car, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face carefully expressionless, looking for all the world like an ordinary old man, caught up in some terrible mistake, rather than a murderer finally facing consequences, 28 years after his crime. The footage of Robert Mitchell being led to that patrol car would be broadcast on every local news station that evening, would go viral on social media, would be shared and reshared with captions expressing shock, disbelief, rage, horror, satisfaction, a whole spectrum of emotions that people felt watching a cold case finally resolved, watching justice finally arrive, even if delayed by decades. The community reaction was seismic, a collective psychological earthquake that shook Dearborn Heights and rippled outward through Detroit and beyond. Robert Mitchell had lived in Dearborn Heights for 14 years, since his retirement from Detroit public schools in 2010. He'd been a fixture in the community, a familiar face at the local library, where he volunteered every Thursday afternoon, helping seniors learn to use computers, patiently explaining how to send emails and use search engines and video chat with distant grandchildren. He'd been part of a bowling league that met every Tuesday night at Century Lanes, had been on the same team for 8 years, had celebrated their tournament victories, and commiserated over their losses. His grandchildren attended Roosevelt Elementary School, 3 blocks away, where he was sometimes seen at pickup time, where he'd volunteered as a reading buddy in the first-grade classroom, sitting with struggling students and helping them sound out words. People who knew him, who'd interacted with him, who'd considered him a friend, or at least a pleasant acquaintance, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the monster who'd murdered Jennifer Hartwell. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, created a kind of psychological vertigo where nothing made sense anymore, where the ground beneath your feet felt unstable. This couldn't be the same person. There must be a mistake. The DNA evidence must be wrong somehow. But there was no mistake. The DNA evidence was conclusive. The man who'd helped your mother set up her email account, who'd celebrated your good bowling game with a high five, who'd been trusted around children for decades, who'd seemed so normal and kind and helpful, was a murderer. Had murdered a 15-year-old girl, had sexually assaulted her, had strangled her and left her body in an abandoned building, had done this and then gone home to his family and lived a normal life for 28 years. How was that possible? How could someone do something so evil and then function normally in society? How could they coach soccer teams and volunteer at libraries and bowl in leagues and celebrate holidays and seem completely, utterly ordinary? Former students from Mitchell's years as a guidance counselor came forward on social media, sharing their memories of him, trying to process their own cognitive dissonance. Most described him as kind, helpful, someone who genuinely seemed to care about students, who'd written them recommendation letters that helped them get into college, who'd talked them through family problems or academic struggles, who'd been a positive presence in their lives during difficult teenage years. They expressed shock, disbelief, betrayal. How could someone who'd helped them also be capable of murder? A few described moments that, in retrospect, felt uncomfortable. The way he'd stood too close sometimes, the way his hand had lingered on a shoulder just a beat too long, comments that had seemed benign at the time, but now carried sinister weight. One woman, now in her 40s, shared that Mitchell had asked her inappropriate questions about her sex life when she was 16. Questions she'd thought were weird at the time, but had dismissed as awkward attempts to address teenage issues. Another remembered feeling uncomfortable when Mitchell had given her a ride home from school one time, remembered that he'd driven slowly and asked personal questions, and she'd felt relieved when she finally got out of the car, had never accepted a ride from him again. These moments, which had seemed like minor discomforts at the time, now felt like warning signs they'd missed, like near misses, like they'd been in danger and hadn't fully realized it. The question everyone was asking was the same question that haunts every case like this. How did no one know? How did he hide it so completely? How did he fool so many people for so long? And the darker question underneath, how many other people might he have hurt? If he killed Jennifer Hartwell, if he was capable of that kind of violence, was it really possible that she was his only victim? Or were there others, other victims who'd never been found, other crimes that had never been connected to him? The investigation into Mitchell's background intensified after his arrest. became an all-consuming effort to understand who Robert Mitchell really was, what he'd really done during those 28 years between killing Jennifer and being caught. Police looked for other potential victims, other unsolved cases from the years and locations where Mitchell had lived and worked. They pulled every unsolved murder and sexual assault case from Detroit and surrounding areas between 1987, when Mitchell graduated college, and 2024, when he was arrested, created a massive database of potential cases that might be connected. They looked for patterns, for similarities in victim selection, or method, or location. They compared timelines, looking for crimes committed during periods when Mitchell had opportunity, weekends, vacation days, sick days. They pulled his employment records, his personnel files, his calendar of school events. They interviewed hundreds of his former students, asking if anyone had experienced anything inappropriate, any uncomfortable interactions, any moments that stood out. They reviewed every complaint ever filed against him during his time as a counselor, every disciplinary action, every parent concern, every piece of paper in his personnel file. They found remarkably little. One complaint from 1994, 2 years before Jennifer's murder, about Mitchell speaking inappropriately to a female student, asking too many questions about her dating life, comments that had made the girl uncomfortable. The complaint had been investigated at the time by the school's Human Resources Department. Mitchell had been interviewed, had been given a verbal warning about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries, and the matter had been closed. The file noted that Mitchell had apologized, had said he was only trying to understand students' lives so he could better help them, had promised to be more careful about his questions. The warning hadn't been serious enough to go into his permanent file or affect his employment. In 2001, a parent had expressed discomfort with Mitchell giving her daughter rides home from school when she missed the bus, said it seemed inappropriate for a male counselor to be alone in a car with female students. Mitchell had been told to stop giving students rides. He did. The principal's notes indicated that Mitchell had been apologetic, said he was only trying to help, understood the concern, wouldn't do it again. These were minor red flags, moments where something seemed slightly off, but they hadn't added up to anything at the time, hadn't triggered serious investigation, hadn't been enough to make anyone think Mitchell was dangerous. In hindsight, knowing what they knew now, investigators wondered if these moments were signs of something darker, if Mitchell had been testing boundaries, seeing what he could get away with, grooming potential victims. But at the time, they'd seemed like nothing, like minor missteps in judgment rather than evidence of predatory behavior. Whether there were other victims remains an open question. No other DNA matches have been found. No other cases have been definitively linked to him. But that doesn't mean Jennifer Hartwell was his only victim. It just means that if there were others, they remain undiscovered, their cases unsolved, their families still waiting for answers that may never come. Robert Mitchell was arraigned on first-degree murder charges on March 29, 2024, 2 days after his arrest. He appeared in 34th District Court in Romulus, wearing an orange jumpsuit issued by the Wayne County Jail, his hands and feet shackled, flanked by 2 sheriff's deputies. His family was not in the courtroom. Sharon Mitchell had filed for divorce within 48 hours of his arrest. His children refused to speak to him, refused to visit, refused to take his calls from jail. He was alone. Judge Sarah Matthews presided over the arraignment, reading the charges in a clear voice. First-degree murder, in the death of Jennifer Marie Hartwell, first-degree criminal sexual conduct, kidnapping. The prosecution requested remand without bond, arguing that Mitchell was a flight risk and a danger to the community. Mitchell's attorney, a court-appointed public defender named James Thornton, because Mitchell couldn't afford to hire a private attorney and his family had refused to help pay for his defense, argued that Mitchell had no prior criminal record, had ties to the community, wasn't a flight risk. Judge Matthews denied bond. Mitchell would remain in custody until trial. Thornton entered a plea of not guilty on Mitchell's behalf. The judge scheduled a preliminary examination for April 15th to determine if there was enough evidence to bind Mitchell over for trial. Mitchell stood there through the whole proceeding, his expression blank, showing no emotion, no reaction, nothing. He was asked if he understood the charges against him. He said yes. He was asked if he understood his rights. He said yes. That was all. He was led back to the Wayne County Jail, where he would remain in protective custody, separated from general population because child killers don't fare well in jail, because other inmates have their own code of justice, and someone who murdered a 15-year-old girl would be at the bottom of the prison hierarchy, would be a target for violence. Mitchell's attorney, James Thornton, was 34 years old, had been a public defender for 6 years, had handled dozens of murder cases, but nothing quite like this. The evidence against his client was overwhelming. The DNA match was conclusive. There was no question that Robert Mitchell had killed Jennifer Hartwell. Thornton's job wasn't to prove innocence. He knew his client was guilty, and the evidence made that impossible to dispute, but to ensure that Mitchell received a fair trial, that his constitutional rights were protected, that the state met its burden of proof, that the process followed the law. Thornton tried every legal avenue available, not because he wanted Mitchell to go free, but because that was his job, because the system requires vigorous defense even for the obviously guilty, because the rights that protect the guilty are the same rights that protect the innocent. He argued that the DNA evidence, while placing Mitchell in contact with Jennifer Hartwell, didn't prove murder beyond reasonable doubt, an argument that was legally creative but practically absurd, given that Mitchell's DNA had been found inside Jennifer's body at a crime scene where she'd been sexually assaulted and murdered. Thornton tried to suppress the genealogical DNA evidence, arguing it violated Mitchell's Fourth Amendment rights, that using distant relatives' DNA to identify him without his knowledge or consent was an unreasonable search. The judge denied the motion, citing precedent that family members voluntarily submitted DNA doesn't create privacy expectations for criminal defendants. Thornton tried to argue that the chain of custody for the 1996 DNA sample was questionable, that 28 years of storage created too many opportunities for contamination or degradation or mishandling. The judge reviewed the evidence logs, found them meticulous, found that the sample had been properly stored and properly handled, denied the motion. Thornton tried to get the confirmatory coffee cup sample suppressed, arguing that Mitchell hadn't abandoned it, that he'd thrown it away expecting privacy in his trash. The judge cited multiple precedents establishing that trash in public receptacles is abandoned property, with no expectation of privacy, denied the motion. Every legal challenge Thornton raised was denied. The evidence was solid. The process had been proper. There was no legal basis to exclude anything. The trial was scheduled for September 2024, 6 months after Mitchell's arrest. Time for both sides to prepare their cases, even though the outcome seemed inevitable. During the months between arraignment and trial, Patricia Hartwell gave interviews, appeared on every platform that would have her, became the public face of Jennifer's case. She appeared on local news broadcasts, on true crime podcasts, on cable news programs like 48 Hours and Dateline NBC. She talked about Jennifer, always talked about Jennifer first, made sure that people remembered her daughter as a person rather than just a victim, as a 15-year-old girl with dreams and personality, and people who loved her rather than just a name in a case. She talked about the 28 years of waiting, about what it's like to live in limbo, to not have answers, to know your daughter was murdered but not know who did it, to look at every man you pass on the street and wonder if he's the one. She talked about the relief of finally Having answers mixed with the rage of knowing her daughter's killer had lived free for nearly 3 decades, had raised his own children while hers was in the ground, had celebrated holidays and birthdays and grandchildren while the Hartwells had nothing but an empty chair at Thanksgiving dinner and a grave to visit. She talked about her husband Thomas, who died without seeing justice for their daughter, who'd spent 16 years carrying the weight of Jennifer's unsolved murder, who deteriorated under that weight until his heart literally gave out. She wondered if Thomas would still be alive if they'd caught Mitchell sooner, if the stress and grief of the unsolved case had contributed to his death, if Mitchell had effectively killed both Jennifer and Thomas. She talked about the importance of DNA databases, of funding for cold case units, of forensic genealogy as a tool for solving old crimes, of never giving up on victims, no matter how much time had passed. She became an advocate for other families, speaking at conferences about victim rights, testifying before the state legislature about maintaining funding for cold case investigations, supporting bills that would expand DNA collection and make it easier to use genealogical techniques. She became the face of the case in a way she hadn't been able to be when the investigation was active, when she'd been too destroyed by grief to be functional, too overwhelmed to be public. But now, with Mitchell in custody, with justice finally possible after decades of waiting, Patricia found a strength she didn't know she had. She wanted people to remember Jennifer not as a victim, but as a person, as a 15-year-old girl who'd loved animals and played clarinet and drawn hearts on her white Keds. She wanted Jennifer's life to mean something beyond her death, wanted her daughter's murder to result in something positive, some change that might prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. If Jennifer had to die, and she did, nothing could change that now. Then at least let her death lead to something. Let it help other victims. Let it keep other children safe. That was what Patricia Hartwell told herself as she gave interview after interview, as she appeared on television again and again, as she spoke Jennifer's name over and over to audiences who'd never met her daughter but came to know her through Patricia's words. The trial began on September 16th, 2024, at the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice in downtown Detroit, in a courtroom on the 5th floor, with large windows overlooking the city. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Lauren Mitchell, no relation to the defendant, a coincidence that might have been darkly funny if the circumstances were different, who'd been specifically assigned to the case because of her extensive experience with DNA evidence. She'd prosecuted more than a dozen cases using genealogical DNA, had a perfect conviction record, knew the science cold, and could explain it to juries in terms they could understand. She was 49 years old, had been a prosecutor for 22 years, had made this her specialty. The trial lasted 3 weeks, 3 weeks of testimony and evidence and legal arguments, 3 weeks of Patricia Hartwell sitting in the courtroom every single day, never missing a moment, watching the man who'd killed her daughter, watching the process of justice grind forward with agonizing slowness. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence first, the foundation of their case. They called Dr. Rebecca Chen to testify about the genealogical investigation, about how she'd built the family tree, about how genealogical DNA works, about how she'd narrowed thousands of possible descendants down to one suspect. Dr. Chen was calm and professional on the stand, explained complex genetic concepts in accessible language, showed charts and diagrams that illustrated how family trees work, how DNA inheritance creates patterns, how those patterns can be used to identify suspects. The defense tried to attack her methodology, suggested that family tree construction was more art than science, implied that she might have made errors. Dr. Chen calmly explained her work, showed her documentation, demonstrated that she'd been thorough and careful, that her conclusions were sound. The prosecution called forensic scientists from the Michigan State Police Lab to explain DNA analysis, to walk the jury through how the 1996 sample was collected and preserved and tested, how the 2024 coffee cup sample was collected and tested, how the two samples were compared, how the match probability was calculated. They showed the jury the numbers. The probability that the DNA from Jennifer's crime scene belonged to Robert Mitchell was 99.99997%, a number so close to certainty that the difference was meaningless. There were maybe 3 other people on Earth who could have that DNA profile, and they'd all be Robert Mitchell's identical twin brothers, which he didn't have. The defense tried to create doubt about DNA science, brought in their own expert to suggest that contamination was possible, that the decades-old sample might have degraded, that the chain of custody wasn't perfect. But the evidence was too strong, too well documented, too thoroughly scientific. The jury could see that. The prosecution presented the timeline of February 14th, 1996, showed the security footage of Jennifer leaving school, presented testimony from witnesses who'd seen her that day, presented evidence from the crime scene, photographs that were difficult to look at, that showed Jennifer's body, that made this real in a way that words couldn't. They called the medical examiner who'd performed the autopsy, Dr. Harold Washington, now retired, but still sharp and clear in his testimony. He explained Jennifer's injuries, explained cause of death, explained the evidence of sexual assault, explained what had been done to this girl in clinical terms that made the horror somehow worse because they were so precise, so detailed, so inescapable. Patricia Hartwell sat in the courtroom and listened to this, listened to the description of what had been done to her daughter, and she didn't look away, didn't leave, didn't break down. She owed it to Jennifer to be there, to bear witness, to make sure that Jennifer wasn't alone, even in this recounting of horror. The prosecution called Patricia Hartwell to testify about her daughter, to humanize the victim, to make sure the jury understood that Jennifer was more than evidence in a case, that she was someone's child, that her absence had left a hole that never healed. Patricia took the stand, was sworn in, and spoke about Jennifer in a steady voice that only occasionally wavered. She told the jury about Jennifer's dream of being a veterinarian, about her kindness to animals, about how she volunteered at the shelter every Saturday morning. She told them about the stuffed elephant named Peanut, about the notes from Marcus saved in a shoebox, about the hearts Jennifer had drawn on her white Keds that last morning. She told them about the 28 years of waiting, of not knowing, of living in limbo, and she told them what it meant to finally have answers, to know that the man who'd killed her daughter was sitting right there in that courtroom, was finally being held accountable. She looked at Robert Mitchell when she said this, looked him in the eyes, and he looked back at her with that same blank expression he'd worn since his arrest, showing nothing, giving nothing away. The defense didn't have much to work with, but James Thornton tried. He couldn't dispute the DNA. It was conclusive. He couldn't dispute the timeline. Mitchell had no alibi for February 14th, 1996, had called in sick to work, had no one who could verify his whereabouts during the critical hours. He couldn't dispute the evidence from the crime scene. So Thornton focused on reasonable doubt, on the possibility that maybe the evidence didn't tell the whole story, that maybe there were explanations they hadn't considered. He questioned the reliability of genealogical DNA analysis, brought in his own expert to suggest the family tree construction was flawed, to imply that Dr. Chen had made mistakes, that the genetic evidence pointed to Mitchell's family, but not necessarily to Mitchell specifically. The expert testified that genealogical DNA was still relatively new, that the techniques hadn't been thoroughly tested, that there was room for error. The prosecution's rebuttal expert destroyed this argument, explained that genealogical DNA had been used successfully in hundreds of cases, that Dr. Chen's methodology was sound, that the confirmatory sample from the coffee cup eliminated any doubt. Thornton implied that the confirmatory sample from the coffee cup might have been contaminated, might have been planted, might not really be Mitchell's DNA. But the chain of custody was perfect. The collection had been witnessed and documented. There was no plausible way the sample could have been compromised. It was a desperate strategy because there really wasn't any other option. The evidence was overwhelming. Mitchell was clearly guilty. Thornton knew it. The jury knew it. Everyone in the courtroom knew it. But Thornton had to mount a defense, had to try, because that was his job, because the system requires it, because even the obviously guilty deserve representation. Mitchell himself didn't testify. Thornton advised against it, knowing that putting Mitchell on the stand would be disastrous, that the prosecution would tear him apart on cross-examination, that Mitchell's lack of emotion and inability to show remorse would work against him. His daughter Emma testified briefly as a character witness, describing her father as loving and gentle, insisting that he couldn't have done this, that there must be some explanation, that the father she knew wasn't capable of murder. She broke down on the stand, crying so hard she couldn't speak, had to be given a recess to compose herself. She testified that her father had coached her soccer team, had attended all her games, had helped her with homework, had been there for every important moment of her life. She said he was a good father, a good grandfather, a good person. How could a good person do something like this? The prosecution's cross-examination was gentle but firm. They asked Emma if she'd known about her father's whereabouts on February 14th, 1996. She said no, she'd been a toddler. They asked if she'd known about the DNA evidence. She said yes. They asked if DNA evidence could be wrong. She said she didn't think so, but she didn't understand how her father could have done this. They thanked her for her testimony and let her go. Her testimony didn't help the defense. If anything, it reinforced the prosecution's point about Mitchell's ability to compartmentalize, to maintain a facade of normalcy while carrying the secret of murder, to be a loving father while being a killer. The human mind is capable of holding contradictory truths, capable of being two different people simultaneously. Robert Mitchell was both a good father and a murderer. Both things were true. That was the horror of it. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days, going through the evidence methodically, discussing the DNA, discussing the testimony, discussing the timeline. Some jurors told reporters afterward that the verdict was never really in doubt. The DNA evidence was too strong, but they wanted to be thorough, wanted to make sure they'd considered everything, wanted to feel certain before they made a decision that would send a man to prison for life. On October 9th, 2024, they returned to the courtroom. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. The foreman, a retired teacher named Michael Bradley, stood and said yes. The judge asked the defendant to rise. Robert Mitchell stood, flanked by his attorney, his face still showing nothing. The clerk read the verdict. Count 1, first-degree murder in the death of Jennifer Marie Hartwell. Guilty. Count 2, first-degree criminal sexual conduct. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. Patricia Hartwell sat in the courtroom and finally cried, the first tears she'd shed since Detective Santos told her they'd found Jennifer's killer 7 months earlier. She'd held herself together through the trial, through the testimony, through hearing the details of what had been done to her daughter, but hearing that verdict, hearing the word guilty, read aloud in that courtroom, something broke loose inside her, and she wept. Her sons sat on either side of her, their arms around her shoulders, and they cried too. Behind them, the courtroom was packed with people who'd known Jennifer, people who'd followed the case for 28 years, people who'd come to witness justice finally delivered, former classmates now in their 40s with families of their own, teachers who'd retired, neighbors who'd moved away but returned for this, members of the support group who'd shared Patricia's grief for decades, strangers who'd followed the case in the news and felt compelled to be present for its conclusion. When the judge read the verdict, when that word guilty echoed through the courtroom, there was a collective exhale, a release of tension that had been building for 28 years. Justice wasn't just done. It was seen to be done, was witnessed by everyone who cared, was made real and concrete. Robert Mitchell showed no emotion. He sat at the defense table with the same blank expression he'd worn since his arrest, his face carefully neutral, revealing nothing. Even then, at the moment of his conviction, at the moment when his carefully constructed life finally collapsed completely, he gave nothing away. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, was taken back to Wayne County Jail to await sentencing. In 6 weeks, he would be sentenced. In 6 weeks, he would be told he would die in prison. In 6 weeks, the formal end would come. But really, it had already ended. The verdict was the end. Everything after was just procedure. Sentencing took place on November 15th, 2024, a cold Friday morning with snow threatening from heavy grey clouds. First-degree murder in Michigan carries a mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole. There was no discretion here, no negotiation, no alternative. Robert Mitchell would die in prison. The only question was whether additional sentences for the other charges would run concurrently or consecutively, whether Mitchell would serve them all at once, or one after another, though it hardly mattered, given that life without parole meant exactly that. Before the judge pronounced sentence, the court allowed victim impact statements, giving Jennifer's family the opportunity to speak directly to Mitchell, to tell him what his crime had cost them. Patricia Hartwell spoke first. She'd prepared a statement, had written and rewritten it over the past 6 weeks, trying to find words adequate to express 28 years of grief and rage and loss. She stood at the podium, looked directly at Robert Mitchell, and told him about Jennifer. She told him about the stuffed elephant named Peanut that still sat in Jennifer's room, that Patricia still couldn't bring herself to pack away. She told him about the curling iron Jennifer had borrowed without asking that last morning, that Patricia had found later and kept and still had, as though holding on to these ordinary objects could somehow hold on to Jennifer. She told him about the 28 Valentine's days she'd endured, knowing that date meant her daughter's death, that a day that should be about love and celebration had instead become a day of horror and grief, that she would never be able to see hearts or red roses or Valentine cards without thinking of her daughter's murder. She told him about Thomas, about how her husband had died without answers, about how the not knowing had eaten away at him year after year, about how the stress and grief had quite literally broken his heart. She told Mitchell that he'd stolen not just Jennifer's life, but decades of their family's peace, that his selfishness and cruelty had rippled out across years and touched everyone who'd loved Jennifer. She told him about Jennifer's brothers, about how they'd struggled with survivor's guilt, about how Michael had developed anxiety and depression, about how David had struggled with anger management issues for years because of the rage he carried over not being able to protect his sister. She told him about the grandchildren Jennifer would never have, about the life she'd never live, about the veterinarian she'd never become, about all the animals she'd never save, about all the good she'd never do in the world. She told him that he was not just a murderer, but a thief, that he'd stolen Jennifer's future, and their family's happiness, and 28 years of peace of mind. And she told him that she hoped he would suffer every remaining day of his life, that she hoped his guilt would torture him, that she hoped he would die alone and afraid and full of regret. Her voice never wavered. When she finished, she walked back to her seat without looking at Mitchell again. She'd said what she needed to say. She was done with him. Jennifer's brother Michael spoke next. He talked about his little sister, about how she'd followed him around when she was small, how she'd wanted to do everything he did, how she'd begged to be included when he and his friends were playing, how he'd sometimes been annoyed by her persistence, but also secretly pleased that she looked up to him. He talked about the guilt he'd carried for 28 years, the knowledge that he should have protected her, and didn't, even though he'd been at work when she was killed, even though there was nothing he could have done. The guilt was still there, irrational but persistent. He talked about the rage he'd carried for 28 years, the helplessness of not being able to protect her, the torture of not knowing who'd hurt her, of looking at every man and wondering if he was the one, of wanting to exact revenge but having no target for that revenge. He'd imagined this moment for decades, imagined what he'd say to his sister's killer if they ever found him. He'd imagined threats, imagined violence, imagined telling Mitchell exactly what he wanted to do to him, how he wanted Mitchell to suffer the way Jennifer had suffered. Now that the moment was here, he said, he found that he didn't want to give Mitchell any more words, any more energy, any more time. Mitchell had already taken too much from their family. Michael didn't want to give him anything else. He just wanted him gone, locked away forever, forgotten. He wanted to stop thinking about Robert Mitchell and start remembering Jennifer, without the shadow of her murder hanging over every memory. He wanted to reclaim Valentine's Day, to make it about love again, instead of death. He wanted to move forward, and he couldn't do that while they were all stuck in the limbo of waiting for justice. Now justice was here. Now they could begin to heal, or at least try. Jennifer's brother David didn't speak in person. He submitted a written statement that the judge read into the record, describing Jennifer's kindness, her love of animals, her dreams of veterinary school, all the life she never got to live. The statement described the impact of her loss on their family, how Christmas and birthdays and ordinary days had all been colored by her absence, how there was always an empty chair at the table, how they'd had to learn to live with a grief that never really diminished, just became familiar. The statement said that no sentence could truly bring justice for what Mitchell had done, that there was no punishment adequate for stealing a child's life, but that life in prison without parole was at least something, was at least an acknowledgement that what Mitchell had done was evil and unforgivable. Judge William Peterson, who'd presided over the trial, addressed Mitchell directly before sentencing. Judge Peterson was 62 years old, had been on the bench for 19 years, had sentenced hundreds of criminals, but this case had affected him in a way few others had. He'd been a father of teenagers himself when Jennifer Hartwell was murdered, had 2 daughters who were close to Jennifer's age in 1996, had felt the fear that gripped Detroit that winter. He spoke about the particular cruelty of crimes against children, about how society entrusts adults with the care and protection of young people, about how profound a betrayal it is when an adult violates that trust. He spoke about the special responsibility that educators have, that Mitchell had held a position of trust and authority, that students and parents had relied on him to help and guide young people, and he'd used that position to identify and stalk and murder a child. He spoke about the 28 years Mitchell had remained free while Jennifer Hartwell's family suffered, about how Mitchell had lived a normal life, had raised his own children, had celebrated holidays and birthdays and all the ordinary joys of life, while the Hartwells had nothing but grief and unanswered questions. He spoke about the advances in forensic science that had finally made it possible to identify Mitchell, about how DNA technology had given Jennifer's family the answers they'd been denied for nearly 3 decades. He called Mitchell's crimes profoundly evil and his lack of remorse chilling. Mitchell had shown no emotion throughout the trial, had never apologized, had never expressed regret, had never acknowledged what he'd done to Jennifer or to her family. That complete absence of remorse, Judge Peterson said, was as disturbing as the crime itself, showed that Mitchell was not capable of empathy or compassion, was a danger to society who could never be released. Then he pronounced sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole on the first-degree murder charge, to be served consecutively with 25 to 50 years on the criminal sexual conduct charge. The consecutive nature meant that even if some future parole board decided Mitchell should be released on the sexual conduct charge, which would never happen but was technically possible, he'd still be serving the life sentence. Robert Mitchell would die in prison. He was 59 years old. He'd lived more than 3 times as many years as Jennifer Hartwell had been allowed to live. Judge Peterson ordered him remanded to custody immediately. Officers led Mitchell out of the courtroom in shackles, the chains around his ankles making a soft, rattling sound as he walked. He never looked back. Didn't look at his daughter Emma, who was crying in the gallery. Didn't look at Patricia Hartwell. Didn't look at anyone. Just walked out of the courtroom and disappeared into the correction system, into a life of concrete and bars and 23-hour lockdowns, into decades of nothingness stretching ahead until death. The case garnered national attention after the conviction. It became a prominent example of how genealogical DNA technology could solve decades-old cold cases, how families could find justice even after seemingly impossible stretches of time, how persistence and advancing science could overcome even the most carefully hidden crimes. True crime documentaries featured Jennifer's story. Dateline NBC devoted a full hour to the case. 2020 did a special investigation. Investigation Discovery created a detailed reconstruction. Podcasts devoted episodes to the investigation, analyzing the forensic genealogy techniques, interviewing Patricia Hartwell and Detective Maria Santos and Dr. Rebecca Chen. Jennifer's story became known nationally, became a symbol of both the tragedy of cold cases and the hope that they could be solved. Patricia Hartwell continued to advocate for cold case funding, for DNA database expansion, for longer statutes of limitations on violent crimes, for anything that might help other families find the answers she'd finally found. She testified before the Michigan legislature, supporting bills that would mandate DNA collection for all felony arrests, that would provide funding for cold case units in every jurisdiction, that would make it easier for law enforcement to use genealogical DNA techniques. She spoke at conferences about victim rights, at police trainings about the importance of preservation of evidence, at support groups about maintaining hope even when years pass without progress. She started a foundation in Jennifer's name, the Jennifer Hartwell Memorial Foundation, that provided financial support to families of cold case victims, helped fund DNA testing for unsolved cases, offered counseling services for families dealing with the trauma of unsolved violent crimes. She turned her decades of pain into action, into a legacy for her daughter beyond the tragedy of her death. If Jennifer had to die, and she did, that couldn't be changed, then at least let something good come from it. Let her death lead to other cases being solved. Let her memory help other families find closure. That was what Patricia Hartwell told herself as she threw herself into advocacy work, as she built the foundation, as she spoke Jennifer's name again and again, keeping her daughter's memory alive through action. Robert Mitchell is currently incarcerated at Baraga Maximum Correctional Facility in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, about as far from Detroit as you can get while remaining in the state, roughly 500 miles north in a remote area near Lake Superior, where winter lasts 8 months and summer barely exists. He's in general population, though separated from other inmates for his own safety, both because he's a former guidance counselor convicted of killing a child, which puts him at the bottom of the prison hierarchy, and because of the high-profile nature of his case. Child killers are not popular in prison. There's a code among inmates, and people who hurt children violate that code, become targets for violence from other prisoners who have their own children, who draw the line at crimes against kids. Mitchell has been assaulted twice since arriving at Baraga, once in the dining hall when another inmate threw hot coffee in his face, once in the exercise yard when someone hit him from behind with a weight, breaking his collarbone. He spends most of his time in his cell, 6 by 8 feet, a concrete box with a narrow window that shows nothing but sky and the tops of pine trees. He maintains his innocence, or at least he maintained it initially. In letters to his attorney that later became part of the public record, Mitchell claimed he was the victim of a miscarriage of justice, that the DNA evidence had been misinterpreted, that he was being persecuted for crimes he didn't commit. More recently, according to reports from prison officials, he simply stopped talking about the case at all. He doesn't discuss it with other inmates, doesn't discuss it with guards, doesn't discuss it with the prison psychologist who meets with him quarterly. He exists in a kind of silence, going through the routines of prison life mechanically, without engagement, without emotion. He doesn't receive visitors. His wife Sharon filed for divorce in January 2025, just 3 months after his sentencing. The divorce was finalized in April. She kept the house, got half his pension, changed her name back to her maiden name, moved to a different state to escape the stigma of being Robert Mitchell's ex-wife. His daughter Emma and sons Connor and Ryan have not contacted him since his conviction. Emma told a reporter that her father is dead to her, that the man who killed Jennifer Hartwell is not the father she knew, that she's trying to rebuild her life and her sense of identity after learning that everything she thought she knew about her father was a lie. Connor and Ryan have both changed their last names legally, both desperate to distance themselves from their father's crimes. Mitchell is effectively alone with what he did. Whether that constitutes justice is a question each person has to answer for themselves. Is life in prison without parole adequate punishment for murdering a 15-year-old girl? Is any punishment adequate? These are questions without satisfying answers. The death penalty might seem more appropriate to some, but Michigan abolished capital punishment in 1846, was actually the first English-speaking territory in the world to do so. Mitchell will die of old age or disease in prison, will spend decades in that concrete box, thinking about nothing or thinking about everything, and which would be worse is unclear. For Patricia Hartwell, the sentence is both satisfying and inadequate. Satisfying because Mitchell will never be free, will never hurt anyone else, will die behind bars. Inadequate because no punishment can restore Jennifer, can give back the decades they lost, can make things right. Justice is imperfect, is always imperfect, is at best a pale shadow of what's been lost. The warehouse where Jennifer Hartwell was killed is gone, demolished in 2003, but the lot where it stood remains empty, undeveloped, a patch of concrete and weeds behind a chain-link fence. The memorial plaque the Hartwell family placed there still stands, bolted to a concrete post they installed specifically for this purpose. The CEE plaque is bronze, 3 feet by 2 feet, with Jennifer's name and dates and her photo, her school photo from sophomore year, the same one that was in all the news reports, showing her smiling face, her clear eyes, her whole life ahead of her. The inscription reads, Jennifer Marie Hartwell, August 12, 1980, February 14, 1996. Forever remembered, forever loved. Beloved daughter, sister, friend, may her memory be a blessing. The lot is scheduled for development into affordable housing starting in 2026. A developer has purchased the land, has plans to build a small apartment complex, 8 units of affordable housing for low-income families. Patricia Hartwell has mixed feelings about this. Part of her wants the space to remain memorial, wants it to stay empty as a permanent reminder of what happened there, wants Jennifer's death to be marked and remembered in the geography of the city. Part of her thinks Jennifer would have liked the idea of the empty lot becoming homes for families, becoming something useful and alive rather than remaining forever tied to death. Jennifer had been kind, had cared about people, would probably prefer that the space where she died eventually becomes something that helped others rather than remaining a monument to tragedy. Patricia hasn't decided yet whether she'll oppose the development. She's spoken to the developer, who's promised to incorporate the memorial into the new construction somehow, maybe mounting the plaque on the building, maybe creating a small garden area with Jennifer's name. They're working on the details. Patricia still goes to the lot every February 14th, still holds the memorial service there, though the crowds have grown smaller over the years. In the first years after Jennifer's death, hundreds came, then dozens. Now in 2025, 29 years after Jennifer's murder, maybe 20 people show up. Patricia and her sons and their families, a few of Jennifer's former classmates who still live in the area, members of the support group who've become like family over the decades, a few strangers who followed the case and feel compelled to honor this girl they never met, but they never disappear completely. There are always people who remember, who show up to honor Jennifer Hartwell, to acknowledge that she mattered, that her life had value beyond the violence that ended it. Jennifer's room in the Hartwell house remained untouched for nearly 20 years, remained exactly as she'd left it that last morning, when she'd been in a hurry to get ready for school. Patricia couldn't bear to touch anything, couldn't bear to pack away Jennifer's belongings, couldn't bear to acknowledge that Jennifer would never come home to use them. The room became a shrine, a memorial, a place that existed outside of time. Patricia would sometimes sit in there, on Jennifer's bed, surrounded by her daughter's things, and talk to her, tell her about what was happening in the family, about Michael's wedding and David's new job and the grandchildren she'd never meet. Thomas would find her there sometimes, would sit beside her, would hold her hand, would share the weight of grief that never really got lighter, just became more familiar. But eventually, in 2015, nearly 20 years after Jennifer's death, Patricia finally couldn't bear it anymore, couldn't maintain the pretense that the room was waiting for someone who would never return. She boxed up most of Jennifer's belongings, the clothes, the books, the schoolwork, the clarinet that she'd never played well but had tried so hard with. The stuffed animals went into storage, carefully wrapped in tissue paper and placed in plastic bins, including Peanut the elephant, who'd watched over the room for 2 decades. The notes from Marcus, the boy who'd sat behind Jennifer in algebra and folded his notes into origami shapes, were preserved in the shoebox where Jennifer had kept them, were placed in storage with everything else. Patricia couldn't throw them away. Maybe someday Jennifer's grandnieces or grandnephews would want to know about their aunt, would want to see these artifacts of her life, would want to understand who she'd been beyond the tragedy of how she died. The room became a guest room after that, repainted and refurnished, stripped of Jennifer's presence, but never quite feeling like anything other than Jennifer's room. Some spaces carry memory in their walls, hold on to the past, even when everything visible has changed. The notes from Marcus are still preserved in that shoebox, yellowed now, but still readable, still showing the careful folds, still carrying the weight of teenage affection that never got the chance to develop into anything more. Marcus Washington himself is married now, living in Columbus, Ohio, with his wife and 3 children. He works as an accountant, lives a quiet suburban life, coaches his son's little league team. He told a reporter in 2024, after Mitchell's conviction, that he still thinks about Jennifer sometimes, about the life she might have lived if she'd had the chance, about how strange it is that she remains 15 in his memory while he's aged into middle age, while he's developed a receding hairline and a dad bod and the accumulated weight of responsibilities that come with being an adult. He said he remembers that kiss behind the gym in January 1996, remembers how nervous he'd been, how Jennifer had smiled at him afterward, how he'd thought they had all the time in the world to figure out what they were to each other. They had a month, that was all. 1 month between that kiss and her death. Marcus never gave Jennifer the Valentine's card he'd bought for her, had kept it for years in his own drawer, had eventually thrown it away when he moved to Ohio for college. But he remembers what it said. "You're pretty special. Happy Valentine's Day." Simple and teenage and inadequate, but heartfelt. He wonders sometimes what Jennifer would have become if she'd achieved her dream of being a veterinarian, if they'd have stayed together through high school or drifted apart the way most teenage relationships do. He'll never know. No one will. Jennifer exists in memory as a 15-year-old girl with dreams, frozen at that age forever, while everyone around her has grown up and grown old. The friends who'd sat with Jennifer at lunch that last day, who'd traded chips for sandwiches and talked about Valentine's Day plans, are scattered across the country now, living lives Jennifer never got to live, Careers and marriages and children and grandchildren, divorces and career changes and all the messy, complicated reality of adult life, all the accumulated weight of decades, Jennifer was denied. Ashley Morrison is a high school teacher in Ann Arbor. Keisha Johnson is a nurse practitioner in Atlanta. Sarah Chen is a software engineer in San Francisco. They all remember Jennifer, all think about her on February 14th each year, all wonder what she would have become, all carry the knowledge that they got to live and she didn't. And there's no reason for it, no justice in it, just the random cruelty of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, of encountering a predator on a cold February afternoon. The question of whether there were other victims continues to haunt the case, continues to nag at investigators, even though Mitchell has been convicted and sentenced and locked away. The logical part says that a man capable of murdering a 15-year-old girl, of sexually assaulting her and strangling her and leaving her body in an abandoned building, is probably not someone who did it just once. The statistical patterns of serial offenders suggest that people who commit these kinds of crimes typically have multiple victims, that violence of this nature escalates from smaller offenses, that there's usually a progression. But Mitchell had no prior criminal record, nothing in his background that indicated escalation, nothing that predicted this level of violence. And despite extensive investigation, no other cases have been definitively connected to him. Mitchell worked with teenagers for 21 years, had access to vulnerable young people throughout that time, had opportunity and access and the kind of trusted position that would make it easy to isolate potential victims. It seems almost impossible that Jennifer was his only victim, that a man capable of such violence only acted on it once and then never again. But if there were other victims, where are they? If Mitchell attacked other girls or women, why haven't their cases been connected to him? There are several possibilities. Maybe Mitchell was very careful, very selective, attacked only in circumstances where he could be certain of not being caught, where he could control the evidence and the scene. Maybe there are other victims who've never been found, whose disappearances were never connected to him, whose bodies lie in undiscovered graves or were disposed of so thoroughly that they've never been recovered. Maybe there are victims who survived, who never reported the assault because they didn't think they'd be believed, or because they were afraid, or because they didn't want to deal with the trauma of a trial. Maybe Jennifer really was the only one. Maybe this was an aberration, a single horrific act in an otherwise carefully controlled life. The truth is that no one knows except Robert Mitchell, and he's not talking. He's never confessed to Jennifer's murder, never admitted guilt even after his conviction, never expressed remorse, or provided any information about his motivations or his methods. He sits in his cell at Baraga and says nothing, takes his secrets with him into silence. Investigators continue to look, continue to review old cases, continue to compare DNA when it's available, continue to look for patterns, but so far, nothing has been found. What we know is this. On February 14th, 1996, Jennifer Marie Hartwell was murdered by Robert Mitchell. Whether she was his only victim remains an open question, one that may never be answered. The uncertainty is its own kind of torture, both for investigators who want to solve every case, and for families of other missing or murdered girls who wonder if their daughter, their sister, their friend might have been another of Mitchell's victims. But uncertainty is something they'll have to live with, because Mitchell isn't providing answers, and without his cooperation or new evidence, the truth may never be known. What is known, what is certain and documented and proven beyond any reasonable doubt, is that on February 14th, 1996, Jennifer Marie Hartwell left school at 2:47 p.m. She walked down Fairview Avenue in a burgundy sweater and white keds with red hearts drawn on them. She encountered Robert Mitchell, who abducted her, drove her to an abandoned warehouse, sexually assaulted her, strangled her, and left her body in a second-floor office, where it would be found 2 days later. For 28 years, Mitchell lived free. He raised his family, worked his job, volunteered in his community, presented himself as a good person while carrying the secret of murder. For 28 years, Jennifer's family waited for answers, lived in the limbo of not knowing, suffered through the particular torture of an unsolved case. For 28 years, the case sat cold, the DNA evidence preserved but useless without a match, waiting for technology to advance enough to make identification possible. And then, in 2024, 28 years after Jennifer's death, forensic genealogy finally identified Robert Mitchell as her killer. He was arrested on March 27, 2024. He was convicted on October 9, 2024. He was sentenced to life without parole on November 15, 2024. Now he sits in prison, will die in prison, will never again walk free, in the world that Jennifer never got to see. After decades of waiting, the case is solved. Jennifer's family has answers, if not peace, because peace is probably impossible when your daughter has been murdered, when the person who should have protected children was the one who destroyed yours. But they have answers. They have justice. They have the knowledge that Robert Mitchell will die in prison, will never hurt anyone else, will spend the rest of his life paying for what he did. It's not enough. It can never be enough. But it's what justice looks like in the real world, imperfect and delayed and inadequate, but finally delivered. Patricia Hartwell is 71 years old now. She's lived more than half her life in the shadow of Jennifer's murder, has spent 29 years as the mother of a murdered child, an identity she never wanted, but has carried with strength and grace and determination. She continues her advocacy work, continues to speak Jennifer's name, continues to keep her daughter's memory alive. She's established a foundation that has helped solve 17 other cold cases through funding DNA testing, that has provided support to dozens of families dealing with the trauma of unsolved violent crimes, that has lobbied successfully for legislative changes that make it easier to solve old cases. She's turned her grief into action, her loss into legacy. And every February 14th, Valentine's Day, the anniversary of the worst day of her life, Patricia Hartwell goes to the empty lot where the warehouse once stood, where Jennifer's body was found, where the memorial plaque carries her daughter's name and face. She brings flowers. She lights candles. She speaks Jennifer's name. She tells stories about her daughter to anyone who will listen, to the diminishing crowd that shows up year after year, to the new faces who've heard about Jennifer and want to pay their respects. She makes sure that Jennifer is remembered not as a victim, not as a cold case, not as a statistic, but as a person, as a 15-year-old girl who loved animals and played clarinet and drew hearts on her shoes and had dreams and potential and a future that was stolen from her. That's what justice means, finally. Not just convicting the killer, not just the life sentence, not just the resolution of the case. Justice means remembering. Justice means bearing witness. Justice means refusing to let Jennifer Hartwell be forgotten, refusing to let her become just another name in a file drawer, another unsolved case that got solved. Justice means saying her name, showing her face, telling her story, keeping her alive in memory even though she's gone in reality. That's what Patricia Hartwell has done for 29 years, what she'll continue to do for whatever time she has left. That's her gift to her daughter, her monument to Jennifer's life, remembrance, witness, love that persists beyond death, beyond time, beyond justice itself. Jennifer Marie Hartwell, August 12, 1980 to February 14, 1996. Forever remembered, forever loved, forever 15,